Hello, my name is Josie Sommer, and this is submission number 138, regarding machine learning algorithmic development in the UK's private sector. In this presentation, I'm going to share my research about current machine learning recording practices, approaching the topic from a record-keeping point of view. I'm going to start by giving a bit of background and definition to my perspective before outlining my research aim and objectives, and then giving a summary of the key debates surrounding the topic which emerged from a literature review. I'm going to discuss my methodology for qualitative interviews with machine learning professionals and show some key findings, in addition to briefly discussing themes which emerged during data analysis. I'm also going to gesture towards the conclusions of the research. So at the time of recording, I'm just at this stage of writing up the research. So these are very much at the early stage, but essentially the conclusions so far are that record keeping can contribute to ideas of accountability and transparency, if not regulation, of machine learning, and that communication is going to be key if this is to happen. I'm also going to point towards areas for further research, which I think would help to expand on this topic in a meaningful way. To give some context to the research, I'm just going to explain how I came to this topic and give you an idea of my viewpoint. My experience and background is in archives and records management, so arguably I'm coming at this topic from a standpoint that you wouldn't immediately associate with artificial intelligence or machine learning, and the synthesis of these two fields, or the crossover of these two fields, is very new. I just wanted to briefly describe records management as well for people who aren't familiar. So records management is all about effectively capturing and managing information within an organisation, and it's often done by specific professionals such as a records manager. Records themselves evidence activities in an organisation. So for an example, that could be an invoice or email correspondence, or in this case, source code with comments. Basically anything recording an activity with metadata that gives context. Managing information and documentation appropriately is about ensuring organisations are creating, capturing, storing and disposing of necessary records securely and according to the internal needs of a business, as well as any external legislative requirements. The relevance of records management to AI was initially prompted by a popular science book called The Creativity Code by Marcus de Sautoy, or it was prompted to me initially this way anyway. So in it, the author scoffed at the unrealistic proposition of explaining the workings of machine learning outputs, prompted by Article 22 of the General Data Protection Regulation, which refers to automated decision making. It was the very cheeky good luck with that at the end of this quote that was the challenge that got me thinking about records management. Essentially, my thinking was, if you can't meaningfully explain a machine learning model's outputs by looking inside the model or the black box, maybe through records management you could capture records of the steps of algorithmic development that are used to build that model to produce those outcomes. So this is where I started from and where I gained the impetus for looking at machine learning as a subset of artificial intelligence. The focus on the private sector came after reading UK government guidance, particularly the 2018 Data Ethics Framework published by DCMS. This document sets out guidelines for planning, procuring and deploying AI responsibly in the UK public sector, but the reliance of the public sector on the private sector for procuring this technology seemed to flag contradictions in the demand for transparency and accountability, and contradictions in the achievability of this as well. Then when I started trying to look for sources relating specifically to UK private sector development of machine learning, I found this really tricky. And that's when I started to identify what could be a concerning knowledge gap. So I set out aiming to find out specifically about private sector development all the time using this record keeping lens, or I suppose you could say belief. The aim of the research then was to gather information about current recording practices for machine learning algorithmic development processes in UK private sector companies. The purpose of this was to build or contribute to a platform of knowledge from which record keepers can meaningfully engage with such technology in the future. A secondary aim of this was to gain insight into notions of accountability and transparency that are associated with record keeping, in order to engage with wider debates of future regulation and to see whether record keepers could meaningfully engage to such debates. So the objectives to achieve this were to scope current debates regarding machine learning regulation and the inclusion or exclusion of records management from such debates, to establish types of records created during algorithmic pipeline processes currently undertaken in private sector companies, to identify how records are captured, stored, shared and destroyed, and who's involved or accountable. And put another way, this could be called learning about the life cycle of machine learning records. And then finally, to compare the practices of private sector companies in order to identify obstacles and opportunities for or of record keeping engagement in the current landscape today. So first, a literature review was conducted to achieve the first of these objectives, to scope relevant debates. The literature review surfaced a relatively low engagement from the records management profession with AI and machine learning debates at the moment. The UK Information Commissioner's Office have produced Project Explain, but otherwise the profession appears more concerned, like every other profession, in the capabilities of what this technology can do for them. So for record keeping, that's translating at the moment as automating appraisal of records, which is a process where you discern what you should be keeping, for how long, and what you should be discarding. So kind of the separation into categories of records, I guess, is where the sector is looking at adopting machine learning. But I wanted to look at the topic from the other way around. So how can machine learning, how can records management offer something to machine learning processes? So there's no specific body of literature on this topic at the moment. And as you can see from this diagram, what I tried to do was highlight the key relevant debates to the topic, which might give an insight into recording processes, and to kind of synthesize these debates to build up a relevance or a case for record keeping involvement in this area. So in terms of the literature reviewed, I looked at government papers, NGO reports, scholarly articles, trade journals, blogs and websites. It has to be noted, of course, that this is a rapidly developing industry and field, so I was really only reviewing literature from 2015 onwards, when machine learning has gained the processing capabilities that we know today. It's also useful to keep the commodity status of machine learning in mind, especially with regards to trade literature and the willingness of industries to be open about what is essentially their products and intellectual property and the associated limits of this. So in terms of the key debates that were surfaced, first up we've got studies of risk. This is literature that highlights evidence of real-world risk, often referencing harm caused by socioeconomic, racial or gender bias in model data. A few authors have suggested that a consistent accountability of the entire machine learning pipeline, as opposed to just focusing on this data section, would be a way to have true accountability of these processes. And it's this broader view that records management can really contribute to, because it's at its best when it underpins all the functions of an organisation. And the next debate was regulation and ethical guidance. So at the moment, machine learning development exists in a space without sufficient legislation regarding development, and so debates appear to have stalled in ethical arguments, basically. There's been an abundance of ethics guidelines, statements and agreements published by governments, organisations and AI developers. And concerns have been expressed, for example, by Floridi about digital ethics shopping. So basically, it's all coming down to what do ethics actually mean and do they have any teeth? And while people debate what regulation might look like, records management could help to provide tangible evidence of these practices. In terms of explainability, a key debate surrounds conflicting statements about how explainable black box machine learning is, and has resulted in what Edwards and Vail call the transparency fallacy. And the real standout factor for me here is that there's a bit of a power struggle, I think it's fair to say, maybe going on between developers and people who would like to see inside machine learning processes about what is actually possible and what can be explained. And that leads quite nicely onto accountability and transparency. This area revealed that there's a real confusion about who's accountable for machine learning, both in terms of development and outputs. There are measures such as data protection impact assessments in the UK and algorithmic impact assessments in Canada, But again, these are based in the very early design stages or data processing stages. And I think what we really need is accountability, as I said, for that whole pipeline. And again, that's something that records management can meaningfully contribute to. In terms of specific private sector examples, you can see I've mentioned some industries here, gambling, marketing, human resources and law. And that's because these correlated to the context of interviewees that I would go on to interview for this research as well. So I was looking at the regulatory bodies for these industries and seeing them, what they'd said about machine learning. All of them obviously wanted to adopt machine learning for their own practices, but in terms of regulation, HR didn't have anything to say about this, but gambling, marketing and law all had high-level strategy documents which flagged regulation of machine learning as an area for consideration, but nobody said in any kind of detail how they were going to do that or what that would look like. And then lastly, we have recording machine learning pipeline processes. This is obviously the most directly relevant to this area of research. And the most relevant source, I think, at the moment is the Partnership on AI. So their About Machine Learning project establishes the benefits of documentation in line with record-keeping professional literature without making that explicit link, probably because that's not intended or not known maybe, but qualities such as accountability, transparency, business continuity are all very much tied into the same underpinnings of record keeping, but as I say, there hasn't been that explicit link drawn. So Partnership on AI are looking through this project to create a flexible but standardized list of documentation for machine learning, and that isn't the purpose of this research, but I am very excited to see what they will come up with in their first draft, which is due to be released soon. The literature review gave a really good indication of current knowledge gaps for the topic, and the gap mainly is in on-the-ground information about actual records created and record-keeping processes undertaken by machine learning practitioners. So to progress, I conducted qualitative interviews with machine learning practitioners currently working in the UK's private sector. I initially aimed to make contact with record keepers or information governance professionals at AI developers, but nobody listed anyone, with no company websites listed these kind of professionals or job descriptions or job titles, which was in itself quite surprising. But through the interview process, I think I gathered that this is quite a new thing and these professionals are only just starting to be introduced into large firms. So the next best thing for me was to connect with practitioners, and that's data scientists and machine learning engineers mainly. Out of around 30 invitations sent to specific practitioners via LinkedIn, using personal networks and inquiries made via company websites, I got 4 responses from willing participants. The 4 participants interviewed were working, as I say, in the gambling, human resources, marketing and legal industries. Obviously here it's necessary to acknowledge the limitations of having 4 interviewees from different industries. It doesn't by any means necessarily paint a representative picture of what's going on, but I do think it gives us a good chance to see what records are being made and gain more of a breadth of knowledge about how people are handling these processes at the moment, and to be able to tease out comparisons from a more broad spectrum. Interviews lasted between 50 and 90 minutes, and questions were structured around a functional analysis approach. A functional analysis is a kind of classic records management tool used to identify record-keeping processes within an organisation, so it's particularly appropriate here. Also means that this diagram in particular meant that despite my lack of specific knowledge about machine learning records and what they actually are, that I couldn't gather from the literature review, I would have something to structure these interviews and a kind of a way of reaching a common ground with people that I spoke to. So this diagram was sent ahead of interviews, and the asterisk that you can see there next to records of activity followed on to the definition of records, which is outlined in the British Standard 15489 from 2016. All interviews were transcribed and sent to participants for clarification, and these transcripts were then coded using grounded theory in cycles. Codes were collapsed and expanded into themes, which I will discuss after showing you my findings. So here's a table which summarises the context of the participants and their organisations. This is just to give an idea of different contexts. I'm not going to discuss this in any level of detail, and if you'd like, please feel free to pause the video if you'd like to look at it further. In response to the objective of identifying records, this table summarises interviewee insight into what specific records were created at each of those stages of the machine learning pipeline. Interviewees did comment that the pipeline is less linear and more fluid and cyclical in practice, but this reflects where participants themselves place records, which I think is really interesting too. In terms of themes then, 5 key themes emerged from analysis of the interviews. The first of these was a lack of standardisation of record-keeping processes despite a shared understanding of standardised machine learning processes. So even though their practices are similar, the records that were kept and the way that they were kept differed. So if I just skip back to the previous slide, I think the most obvious example is the problem definition stage, which is just the first stage at the top of your screen. So participant A and B both kept records for this stage, but participant B's was a lot looser and informal and more casual as to which records were actually kept for every project. Participant C was really reluctant to offer any kind of example in terms of how problems were defined and who defined them. And participant D saw this stage as not applicable because they've got one model and all the new models that they make are just replicating that original model's architecture. So they didn't see any need for any new problem definition documentation. And there was none for the original model either. Participants cited resource limitations as a hindrance to improving record-keeping practices, as well as the fact that this is a really new way of working and people are still figuring things out. So I think record keepers could really contribute here, not only with a view to improving practices, but also communicating an idea of what records are and what they can be used for. So a lot of communication would be needed in this area. But you can see from this diagram that there are similarities, but there are also differences. So the next theme that emerged was that understanding was a barrier. This was really interesting and surprising because the barrier was represented as both convenient and inconvenient. So all participants described their roles as wide-ranging with real advocacy or power, particularly with regards to what models were made and how. But they all described that no one really knew what they did in the organisation, as you can see from this quote here. A lot of them, well, some of them identified as well that communication was needed. So 3 out of 4 did a lot of presentations to try and communicate what they did, and those presentations used records. So there's an understanding that communication can be done through records and the use of them there. But how far they let this go made it kind of seem like the understanding as a barrier was convenient. So people didn't really go into any level of depth. It was almost as though they enjoyed that freedom and the kind of murkiness of people not really knowing what they did. That's particularly interesting, I suppose, when you think that they have already stated that they have a powerful role, so they have the power to impact these processes and communication channels as well. And then this fed into a lack of accountability. So all participants identified themselves as responsible, but not accountable. And the distinction between those two was really interesting. So the main argument here was, I don't see myself as accountable because no one's holding us to account. But then this became kind of self-reinforcing when you consider as well the understanding barrier. So I asked participants C about audits because they've been mentioning a data governance board that they recently instated, and whether they've ever asked for records of algorithmic development for any audits. You can see the answer at the bottom there, and they said that they haven't been asked for any records, and it would be more likely that they would hand over the records anyway, because they wouldn't expect the data governance board to necessarily know what the issue or the problem was. So there is a knowledge, again, that this understanding is an issue, but a lack of willingness to overcome it. And it does leave practitioners in a space where accountability maybe can't be enforced. Again, records management tools and communication tools would potentially help to overcome this. So the next theme that emerged was that risk depends on data and application. So all participants only identified risk in the data preparation stages of building machine learning models, particularly with regards to personal data or sensitive data. Participant B mentioned that there was, because they didn't use any personal data, there really was no risk. And they all kind of viewed, because of the security measures around data or their actual application themselves, to have very low to no risk, particularly the startup companies. But when you think about the actual context of their applications, so they're not necessarily affecting health, for example, but they are promoting monetized or information content. And in the case of the legal services, they're looking at work type replacement. So that's got a real impact on workers at their organization. So I think as well, there's kind of additional debate that's happening about where we should explain things and what is considered high stakes. All of these models had impacts on people and users. And I think that rather than only kind of applying explanations to one type of stake or to high stakes models, records management would give an underpinning accountability to all models, regardless of stake, and it's just looking after the byproducts of what you do, basically. But this idea of risk and the applicability of risk fed into a theme of resistance towards regulation. So as you can see, everyone was generally positive about regulation, but everybody was resistant to it, depending on whether it applied to them or not. And where it didn't apply was where it would be restricted to innovation or where they were a startup. So it wasn't really fair to apply it. Obviously, regulation doesn't necessarily need to be really negative and restrictive, but there was a reiteration which I found really interesting of this understanding barrier. So participant B expressed a lack of faith in the state to regulate machine learning effectively because they just wouldn't understand, and an expert should do this instead. And I think, again, it is a defensive, convenient barrier as well as a real inconvenience. And again, records, I think, would contribute to overcoming this. So what are the conclusions? As I said, these are really early stage conclusions, but I think obviously record keeping can offer functions of accountability, transparency, and auditability in the whole machine learning pipeline, which is really unique and really useful. And if this is going to be achieved, or record keepers are going to assist machine learning engineers and data scientists in any way, communication is key from both sides. In terms of further research, I would just suggest more, really. So more case studies, observational studies of people actually creating the records and managing them, and a greater number of participants would obviously give greater insight too. So thank you very much for listening. I'd be happy to talk about this research further. If anybody's interested, please drop me an email here. And thank you again, and I will see you at the conference.